All right, cool. That's recording, so go for it.
Okay, cool. All right. Lee Gambin, welcome to the show. In many ways, you're living my dream life, living in Australia, writing all your books, having the Cinemaniacs, and you don't know Rusty Stark. You have no idea who he is.
No, I don't. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to have you on here. I was just reading your book about the Howling past couple days.
Mm-hmm.
How did you first come across the Howling, and what was your first experience with it?
Yeah, cool. As a kid, I was very young. I was very, very lucky to have a mother who loved films as well, and was always happy to let me watch whatever I wanted to watch. And film was such an important thing for me growing up. I fell in love with movies very early. And The Howling was one of those films that I caught late night on Channel 9. And I remember it aired the same night that Sybil aired, which was a miniseries, a made-for-TV miniseries with Sally Field about the multiple personalities. And I remember seeing that as well. And just remember recalling snapshots from that, especially sequences when she was having flashbacks as a kid, played by Natasha Ryan, who was also in Kingdom of the Spiders and the Amityville Horror. But anyway, I digress. And The Howling came on later, and it was also a night, I think Rosemary's Baby was being promoted. Anyway, I remember seeing The Howling and just falling in love with it straight away and just being obsessed. And the main thing that sort of captivated me as a monster movie fan, and especially as a werewolf fan, was that it was about a community of werewolves rather than just one rogue werewolf. So it wasn't
huge, yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't the wolf man. It was like a community, and there was politics. And even at that young age, I remember being like so obsessed with all their different standing points in, their pack, I guess, or the way they sort of worked in the colony. And it stemmed from there. So I used to draw the characters over and over again, TC and Marsha and Eddie, etc., and just became obsessed with them. And then just the next time it was on television, I definitely taped it and wore that VHS out, and then bought it, the CEL video. I bought it, which was a nice... in the 80s, they had this company called CEL, Home Entertainment, and they were like these slipcase videos. And I bought that and added that to my collection of, The Wizard of Oz and Dark Crystal and Chomps, a bunch of stuff. But yeah, I just loved The Howling straight away, and I loved everything about it. And as I grew up, I loved the social commentary and the style, the way it looked, the feeling it sort of evoked, its moodiness, its intelligence, and just how cool it was as a film, and sort of grew up with it. And it definitely became one of my all-time favourites as far as, 80s horror and especially werewolf cinema, which I love.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I grew up with it, and that's how I first came in contact with it. And I remember certain memories of the lounge room, the family sort of gathered around watching the movie. I remember my dad, who's no longer with us, he died when I was 8, but I remember my dad never really liked or got horror movies, or never really understood why I was obsessed with them, and he got into The Howling. And I remember him kind of going, you've got to kill them with fire. I was like, that'll do it. So this kind of thing, sort of, this happening as a kid, remembering that, going, oh, cool, even that film hooked my dad, who didn't like horror movies, whereas my mum loves them and still does. So it was really interesting to sort of see that and hear that from that perspective as well.
Now, I didn't watch The Howling in a really long time until I watched it the other day, and these werewolves are very horny.
Yes.
Usually vampires are horny and werewolves are not very horny. But in this film, they're pretty horny. This is a real question, though. Are there more movies where werewolves are horny, or is this pretty much the movie where werewolves are horny?
Absolutely. I mean, so John Sayles, who wrote the screenplay, sort of used the sexuality of the werewolf as an id response, I guess. So basically, people who repress their sexuality would never make great werewolves, whereas people who had this sort of sexuality embedded in them, and allowed themselves to succumb to their sexual needs and desires, would make great werewolves. Which is why Marsha sort of sees the Christopher Stone character as an ideal werewolf mate. Because she sees something quite primal in him. And Eddie sees Dee Wallace's character, Karen, not as a sexual being, but as a major influencer, because she's such a big media icon. But yeah, absolutely. Werewolves are maybe not as sexual as the vampire has been sort of portrayed and presented in film history, but definitely it's there because it's kind of bestial and primal and very animal. So even if you look at American Werewolf in London, that whole film is about sort of curing loneliness and sort of, these two people sort of find each other in England, this working class nurse and this young Jewish boy from New York who's sort of, displaced. And the werewolf transformation is highly sexual. It's kind of like this sort of almost sort of another sort of take on puberty or the agonies of puberty. The sprouting.
That's a great point.
Yeah,
that's a great point.
So the werewolf stuff is pretty much an analogy of sex as well, and sort of tapping into your sort of natural, bestial, primal, primitive state. And there's a lot of Mexican werewolf movies sort of celebrate sexuality in there. You have films earlier as well where you have werewolves as a response to repression and oppression. And even if you think of something like the Wolfman, it comes from a long lineage of, the Nazi regime. Kurt Siodmak came from, escaped that and brought that into the film fabric of the Wolfman itself. And he marries it with the sexuality. The Lon Chaney character is this sort of Greek tragic hero, this, really sort of sad loner, but his sexuality is in there. It's embedded in there because it sparks and sort of comes to its fore when he meets Gwen, played by Evan Lanankers. So there's this kind of, this juxtapositioning of this tragic figure as well as a sexually aggressive figure or sexually self-possessed figure. So it's an interesting sort of balance there, whereas the vampire most certainly is either plague carrier, parasite, or incredibly glamorous and beautiful and seductive, be they women or men. So there's very much, and also the biting and the bloodletting, and it's all very sexual and all that sort of stuff, and bodily fluids being transferred, etc. Whereas the werewolf thing is much more about the sexuality, is much more about the actual expression of the transformation itself, I think.
Here's a dumb question. You did so well with that dumb question. I'm gonna give you another one. You have a book about animal attacks movies, especially of like the 70s, kind of like environmental backlash movies.
Mm-hmm.
The werewolf. Is the werewolf one of those animals? It seems like it's kind of removed from the animal world, even though it clearly is an animal.
Well, it's it's a supernatural horror film, whereas the eco horror film is called the natural horror film. So obviously, with the natural horror films, you have science influencing the animals as well. So basically, I've kind of in my studies on ecological horror, I've mapped it out to a bunch of different eco-horror film subgenres within that subgenre. And one would be the natural horror film, where basically animals attack people based on revenge or based on just inexplicable attacks. Or it could be pretty much a very human-centric film where the actual humans are the more principal players, and they inadvertently influence the natural order and the course of the natural order and disturb it. And then thirdly, there's also the science-based one. So animals that grow huge and grotesque and massive because of atomic warfare or pesticides and things like that, where that kind of causes the backlash against humanity. And then there's also the human help element ones, where the eco-horror films where basically animals help humans who are sort of disenfranchised or alienated or ostracized, and they come and assist these people. So things like Willard.
Ben or Monkey Shines.
Exactly. Well, Monkey Shines is different. But yeah, anyway, so going back to your question about werewolves, that's like a folkloric monster. So that's like something that comes all the way back to, century-old folklore and witchcraft and all that sort of stuff. So it doesn't really tie into the environmental thing. And werewolves aren't real, as opposed to dogs or bears. I mean, lycanthropy is absolutely real. Most certainly it is. But werewolves themselves, I wish they were.
I remember when I was a kid, I got a book out of the library, and it said if you go into a field, strip naked, and say homini homo lupus, which is Latin for wolf to man or something like that, and you'll turn to a werewolf. And I really thought this was true, and I was like, I better not accidentally do that.
Yeah. Well, there's this... Yeah, there's this really beautiful folklore legends of how to turn into a werewolf. One is like if you drink the rainwater from a paw print of a wolf. Another one, if you're an illegitimate child born on Christmas, it's like an insult to God, so therefore you're going to be cursed as a werewolf, which is what happens to Oliver Reed in Hammer's beautiful film Curse of the Werewolf.
Wow, really?
And yeah, and he's born from rape, and he's born on Christmas Day, so he's cursed to be this werewolf. Obviously, biting. If you wear the skin of a wolf, if you make deals with the devil, all this stuff. These are all beautiful legends that werewolf legends that basically sort of suggest where the origins of lycanthropy come from. And every nation, every country, especially across Europe and Asia and America, actually, North America, Native American Indians, but they have linkage to different animals. So, for instance, in certain Asian countries, rather than wear werewolves, it would be more wear tigers or wear mongoose or wear cobras.
Oh, wow.
But because of Europe and monsters and sort of monster legends being so Eurocentric, wolves were kind of the menace. They were the creatures children were warned about. Little Red Riding Hood is a perfect werewolf story. Don't stray from the path. And there's that whole stuff there. So basically, wolves became this sort of monstrous creature, and the worst thing a human could be would be to be at one with the wolf and become the wolf. So yeah, it's interesting sort of stuff there. So that kind of long history of how people turn into wolves is fascinating. And in the Howling, it's pretty much from a bite. And that's all set up with Dick Miller's character, who runs the occult bookshop, who kind of runs through the law. He runs through the rules, and it's really cool. It's very clever.
Yeah. That scene was a little awkward, just because, but I kind of liked how, Dick Miller's just shooting that stuff out, because it's like, we need to get that information, especially the burning part.
So Joe Dante, who's a genius, said this is the first werewolf movie where the characters in the movie know what werewolves are. So when Dick Miller's talking to Belinda Balaski and Dennis Dugan, that we already know that they're savvy, hip people who watch werewolf films. That they're watching the Wolfman in their bedroom. But it's because these characters already know what werewolves are. They don't need to research that. What they need to know are the rules of how the rest of the movie is going to sort of pertain into how to kill them off, or what the rules are. So it's kind of it's a self-referential film. It's a postmodern werewolf movie. So basically, the characters in the film know about werewolves, and Dick Miller's job there is to basically give you the guidelines very quickly in one scene, and that will dictate the rest of the film and how the Dennis Dugan character sort of pulls off his heroic antics. Just
a quick side note, Dennis Dugan, I had never realized that guy is the Adam Sandler director. Mm-hmm. That guy from The Howling is the Adam Sandler director.
That's right. He's in a really good film, a blaxploitation film called Norman, Is That You? He plays the son of Red Fox's boyfriend, actually. So he plays a gay guy, the white gay lover of a black dude in a film called Norman, Is That You? Which is based on a play. And he's terrific in it. Wow. Yeah, and he also pops up in, masterworks like Day of the Locust. He's one of the artists that works alongside William Atherton, one of my favourite films. But yeah, really cool guy, and he gave a great interview. Talented actor, but definitely more known for his directing.
So your book goes. I love your. Anyone who likes horror books should get all of Lee's work. But I love how you go through the movie and then you kind of lay out sort of all the interviews like as you're going through the plot of the movie. So it's kind of like an oral history that goes along with like as the movie's progressing. Mm-hmm. But I have to say, Dee Wallace is so great, and I don't even think I appreciated her enough until I read your Cujo book and then now this book. She's just so great in these movies.
She's brilliant. She comes from this amazing method of acting, which is basically living in the moment, working in the moment. She studied with a man named Charles Conrad, who taught her to sort of come into the scene and not rehearse, not over-rehearse, which used to drive a lot of performers that worked with her a bit crazy. So Daniel Hugh Calley, who plays her husband Vic Trenton in Cujo, came from soap operas. He came from TV. He came from Hardcastle and McCormick. And he was kind of obsessed with rehearsing, and she was like not at all. So that was kind of interesting to sort of balance out how they performed. But when she worked on The Howling, it was the same deal. So Christopher Stone, her husband, her real-life husband, would like to run through scenes and she wouldn't. So she'd just be in the moment. And her vulnerability and her intelligence and her heightened awareness and everything that works with her, for her, shines in these movies. She's brilliant to watch. She's captivating. And there's such an energy. And what's one of her techniques is you just build yourself up to this high point, this incredible... insanely high energy point, and then you just go for it. And then all you need to remember, clearly your lines and your marks, but just taking it as you go and just living in the moment in the films, just as you would in life. You don't rehearse life, right? So that's how she performs. And I feel like with the Howling, she really does encompass that vulnerability, that nervous energy. There's that sweetness and frailty, but there's also this kind of... this edge in her performance as well. I think people sort of miss that. But you watch it and you're like, this is a careerist. This is a strong careerist woman who just has this traumatic experience happen. And then also the resistance she has throughout the whole film of not succumbing to this werewolfery, this colony. I love it. I love her performance in it. But I feel like her, tour de force performance is found in Cujo. I just think that is just remarkable because it's like, wow, you get to that ending point, that last act where it's just really pretty much a physical role, this kind of, really grueling, harrowing experience in that car with that kid and that rabid Saint Bernard, and you have the build-up point to that where it's this really complicated, lonely woman, really interesting, introspective stuff going on there. And I loved when I spoke to her about the Cujo stuff where she... originally in one of the screenplay drafts, I believe it was Barbara Turner's draft, uses a segment in the book from Stephen King, which I coined the white noise monologue, where basically Donna confesses to her husband that she's having this affair, and she has this huge monologue in the book. I think it's like 3 or 4 pages, where she talks about how lonely she is and how she doesn't want to become like her mother and her grandmother, and doesn't want to have to sort of just listen to this white noise as life goes by and ticks by outside of her. And Barbara Turner, I think, wrote this passage, and Dee Wallace said, why? This doesn't need to be there. I can do all of that with one look. So it's an amazing thing for actors not wanting more lines, And as a writer yourself, this, actors love to talk. I guess writers like to talk. I mean, look at me, just rabbiting on. But the idea that she just said, I can do all this with one look or just one simple line is amazing. And you watch that scene, it's like, wow. I'd love to have seen a monologue because I love, I love theatre and plays and I love hearing dialogue. And it would have been amazing to see this monologue in Cujo, but it's not necessary. And she was right, I think. But yeah, the Howling and her performance there, once again, she's written by the scripts by John Sayles and also Terence H. Winkless, who also lays the groundwork as well. Both brilliant writers, very different, and bring very different things into it. And Dee takes...
Sorry to jump in.
Yeah.
What was the role of the two writers on that? Like, was John Sayles first, or who was the...
No, Winkless was first. He came in and streamlined the novel. So the Gary Braden novel isn't actually... I mean... I don't know. I don't love it. I don't think it's a great novel. It's got a setup very similar, but very detached from the werewolf aspect. So basically, the Karen character is sexually assaulted by a rapist, and then she goes to the colony, which is called Drago, which is like this old world village, and that goes from there. But the beauty of the script that Winkless and Sayles worked on was they tied in the Eddie Quist assault with the werewolf colony, so that was much smarter. Sayles brought in all the wonderful sort of political, social stuff, and Winkless had all the great, streamlined scenarios that was set up. So they both worked on par with one another. But the Sayles, it's very much a John Sayles script with all the, the hidden agenda and the politics and the social commentary. He used the amazing, tragic story, not amazing, it's tragic story of Christine Chubbuck there as an influence as well. The woman that killed herself on air, which a lot of people think Paddy Chayefsky used for Network, but there's a bit of controversy there because that came before it, etc. But the Howling uses a lot of social sort of happenings at the time, especially the touch me therapy fads that were happening, est and all that stuff that was sort of seeping into not only the public sphere and people themselves, taking on, all those things that Margie Empert's character riffs on in that scene as Donna the werewolf, but also into the film culture. So films started to have Estian qualities. I remember researching The Wiz for my musicals book, and Joel Shoemaker, who wrote the screenplay adaptation, loads it with Estian philosophies.
Wow.
Isn't that?
I never knew that.
Yeah.
He wrote The Wiz.
Yes.
Joel Schumacher wrote The Wiz.
Yeah.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, one of his earliest jobs. And so when you watch Diana Ross through that, she's basically screaming and stripped of all sort of, security, and she's going through this Estian trauma in The Wiz, which
What
is...
exactly is Est? I only know it for the Americans, but I'm not really familiar with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically like, it's kind of a therapy where you go and regress and strip everything that you're sort of comfortable with and start fresh. So it's very similar to what the werewolves are about, because they have become bestial, they've become animals. So it's kind of like channeling, your inner child, or, nature is a force that you have to sort of, work within. So all that sort of stuff, basically stripping any kind of security blanket or any kind of modern device that sort of restricts you as someone who'll grow, blah blah blah. But it's it's interesting because the werewolf analogy with Estian therapy fads are so perfectly entwined. Like it makes total sense. It's such a logical response to have that married to each other. The lycanthropy married to Estian philosophies.
I thought I saw John Sayles in this movie, but then when I was reading your book, I think it might have been Mick Garris. A young Mick Garris.
No, John Sayles is in it, and so is Mick Garris. So John Sayles plays...
Oh, they're both in it?
Yeah, John Sayles plays the morgue attendant.
Oh, yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, and Mick Garris is the guy at the end with Kelly Thompson, who was his partner back then. And they're both in the book. I interview both of them. But yeah, they're the ones watching TV when he goes, "What is this?" When Dee's turning into a wolf.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool. And you also talked to Joe Dante about this, right?
Oh, of course, yeah. And he's amazing. Like, I could listen to him talk forever. What I love about him and a lot of his peers of that generation, such as Martin Scorsese and all those guys, they are big film fans. They love movies. So they're not just creating their own incredible works, which are all fantastic. They're also massive film buffs. So to be able to riff with Joe Dante about movies is just one of the best things ever. I'll treasure those conversations with him forever. And he was just terrific. He had all these ideas for The Howling. So one of the most interesting stories I found in the research of The Howling is initially him and Rob Bottin, who designed all the beautiful werewolf stuff, were going to use real wolves. So it was going to be very similar to something like Cry of the Werewolf, which is a 40s movie with Nina Fock, where when she turns into a werewolf...
Oh my God. She was my professor at film school.
Really?
Yeah. Wow.
Wow.
She's in a werewolf movie. Oh my God, I have so many stories about Nina.
Oh my God, yeah, Nina Fox. So the actress was your professor.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Wow.
It was funny because she was so mean, but in a nice way. It was like theatrically mean.
That's great.
Over the course of the semester, you would get to the point where she liked you at the end.
Wow.
And so when we were picking our courses for like the next year, she had another course, and me and my friend were like, well, we've come this far with Nina. We finally got her to like us. We have to stick with her and take the second part of her course. And then, so we go to the second course, and the first day she's like, "And what is your name?" We're like, "Oh my God, we're starting from zero." And it was the same exact process where like we did our first scene, and she's like, "That was terrible."
That's amazing.
I can't believe she was in a werewolf movie. I gotta check this out.
That is so... Cry of the beautiful film. I love that you were taught by Nina Fock. I love her. She's one of my favourites. Because I grew up loving biblical epics. So the Ten Commandments, she's fantastic in that.
It's crazy. And I always think about the way that I found out that she had passed away. I was walking down Hollywood Boulevard, and I saw flowers in the distance on someone's star. Mm-hmm. And I was like, "Isn't that Nina's star?" And I was like, "Oh no, did Nina die?" And I got closer, and I was like, "Nina did die. Oh no." And I thought to myself, though, probably the way she would have wanted someone to find out that she died, seeing flowers on her star at Hollywood Boulevard.
I think that's so good that you were taught by her. That you should be honoured. That's awesome.
Yeah, no, I really.
And she's also in a Killer Snake movie called Jennifer, which was a Carrie ripoff. It's kind of a Carrie Willard hybrid ripoff.
Really? Okay, I'm writing both these down.
Yeah, Lisa Pelican plays this poor kid who goes to an exclusive school, and Nina Fox is the head mistress. So, and I think her role in that probably sounds very similar to what you're talking about as her as a teacher, because she's a real cold bitch in that film.
Yeah.
But yeah, so going back to my point, Cry of the Werewolf,
Yeah.
so she turns into a wolf when she's a gypsy woman, and when she turns into a wolf, she turns into an actual real wolf. I believe it's maybe a timber wolf. So in the original concept for the Howling, when Joe Dante took it on, he was going to use real wolves. So the characters were going to move into real wolves. And they went to see this guy named Lou Schumacher and George Toth, who ran a wolf sanctuary. And George Toth was in charge of the wolves. Lou Schumacher was a famous animal furnisher and animal trainer for many years. And George Toth was in charge of wolves. And when they went there, they were terrified of these wolves, because these wolves would just jump up on them, and you can't really train wolves. They're these animals that you just can't. You can train lions, but wolves you can't. And so they thought, let's just actually do the makeup stuff, which thankfully they did, because the transformation stuff is just gorgeous in the Howling.
So the effects, the werewolf effects are famously done by Rob Bottin, but I don't know if I have this right or not. Did Rick Baker originally work on this, then Rob Bottin took over?
He did, yeah. So Rick Baker, there's a really beautiful new book. It's a 2-volume book on the Rick Baker.
Oh yeah, I saw that. I might order that.
Yeah, stunning. But I think the only still from the Howling of Rick Baker working on it is that one that everyone's seen, where it's most people have seen, where it's him working on this sort of werewolf's head sculpt, and it looks kind of like a Doberman. He was on it for a while, and then he went on to John Landis's American Werewolf film instead, and Rob Bottin took over. And Rob Bottin worked alongside, Greg Canham and Jeff Shank and a whole bunch of people. Great team. Margaret Prentice.
Oh, wow.
All these amazing artists, but Rob Bottin's work is just divine. Like, it's a beautiful, beautiful look.
It's so great.
And also, I love that all the werewolves are distinctly different, because that makes sense. Every human is different, so their werewolf would look different. So I liked that. And once again, it goes back to what I originally said, the idea of a community of them and just a whole bunch of them. Because wolves, are a pack animal, so it makes sense that they live together,
It does, yeah, because it's such a better depiction than the normal loner werewolf.
Yeah.
And the Rob Bottin stuff is great. It's like so much of a piece with his other work. Like, you could see this and you could see The Thing, and you could be like, I think the same guy did that. One small part, but I really laughed out loud at his character, Kevin McCarthy, as like the scummy news producer, is really funny in this. Kevin McCarthy, that's his name, right?
Yeah, he's terrific. He's so good. So basically, he's this kind of, all about ratings. He's kind of like the Diane Christensen character played by Faye Dunaway in Network, I guess. Obsessed with the ratings, and just obsessed with, making sure people are watching. And I love his insensitivity and all that sort of stuff. And I love that the other character, like Dee and Belinda and stuff, just know him so well that they kind of, brush him off and, just sort of deal with him, that whole thing. It's a Mary Tyler Moore analogy there, where Mary has to prop up these men with their egos. That's one of her jobs, poor Mary. And this kind of thing happens here. It's reflected in The Howling as well. And he's just terrific. And Kevin McCarthy, of course, was the star of films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, so good in that. He was used in Joe Dante's Piranha as well. He has that wonderful death scene in Piranha, so Joe Dante had worked with him before. And also,
I remember in the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, exactly. And, his friendship with Monty Clift and Elizabeth Taylor is really interesting. So he was, I believe he hosted the party that Monty Clift drove away from and got into the car accident, and then Elizabeth Taylor had to sort of pluck out teeth from his throat, in her lap. Really full on Hollywood stories, all the glamour. But yeah, Kevin McCarthy, wonderful guy.
I don't actually know that story. Did he die in a car accident?
No, he survived. And then when you see him in films like Suddenly Last Summer and Judgment in Nuremberg, you can see his face is totally reconstructed. Like, he was a very good-looking guy, and he still was, but you could see that he had the scarification sort of healing during the latter period of his career. But yeah, really, really interesting guy, Kevin McCarthy, and lots of cool Hollywood history there. So it's nice to see these awesome actors that were, really strong in the 50s and 60s and stuff popping up in 80s, horror movies. I love that. And that's the beauty of these people like Joe Dante. who are big fans, and they're like, oh, please be in my film. You know, Keenan Wynn in Piranha, and Barbara Steele in Piranha, and then in The Howling you've got Slim Pickens and you know, John Carradine. So all these awesome legends of yesteryear popping up in these awesome horror films of the 80s that we grew up with as well.
And then there's also that moment that I never noticed till this viewing. My background on this computer is Rosemary's Baby, the scene where she's in the phone booth and William Castle is behind her, and there's kind of like a fake suspense there. And the same thing happens here as Roger Corman.
Yeah. Exactly.
And it's such a clever echo.
Yeah.
No one's gonna get.
Yeah. It's just this awesome sort of, you know, the vulnerable blonde and this sort of fatherly type waiting outside. It's terrific. And I love the little gag as well Joe Dante puts in there with Roger Corman fishing for a dime in the phone. So it's like a comment a comment on him
I didn't realize that.
Yeah,
that's good.
Comment on him being, you know, pretty tight with the budget.
So this is a abrupt subject change, but we also talk about sitcoms, and you have a new book about very special episodes.
Yes, that's right. So that's in the works at the moment. So basically, it's going to be a massive thing, massive book. So I'm covering 250 very special episodes, which is a big feat. And I've got wonderful contributing writers. So I've got a whole bunch of different writers contributing essays. Got interviews. There's interviews in there. But yeah, basically, it's all about, you know, sitcoms where they sort of tackled subject matter that would be deemed, you know, serious. So basically there's different kinds of very special episodes that I sort of address. So I did a lecture recently about the topic, and I sort of broke it down to 4 different kinds of very special episodes. One that were very clearly, distinctly about a social topic or a taboo or an issue. One that, you know, sort of had overriding social concerns. Another one where basically characters' lives were sort of jeopardized, or characters had major, you know, changes happen. People were killed off, etc. So there's all these sort of different types. But yeah, I go through everything, and I find like the earliest incarnations and go all the way through.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, go all the way through to probably the end of it, which would be the early 90s with a show like Blossom sort of doing the last lot of them. Because then you have the advent of things like Seinfeld, which sort of killed it all. You know, they were kind of more cynical and no lessons learned, no touchy-feeling subject matter. But the massive wave of it came from the 70s and 80s. So you had the Norman Lear universe with, you know, All in the Family and Maude and Good Times, etc. And then when you get to sort of Reagan-era America, you have the, you know, the morality plays sort of happening in sitcoms, shows like Punky Brewster, etc. But yeah, so it's a really fascinating thing. And like going through all these shows that I grew up with, that you grew up with, it's just amazing to watch, and just seeing how different subject matter are taken on differently from different shows. You know, if you think of the AIDS epidemic, Mr. Belvedere takes it differently, a different approach to, say, Designing Women. And if you look at homelessness, you see Saved by the Bell sort of taking it, you know, in a sort of very saccharine kind of sweet kind of way, whereas Kate and Ally really kind of goes hard. You know, so it's a really interesting, it's a fascinating topic, and it's a lengthy one. I've been doing this for a while now, in between, you know, hundreds of other jobs, but that's fine. It's all cool. But yeah, it'll get there. I'm hoping for a June, July release next year, but we'll see.
What, maybe this is putting you on the spot, but what are some episodes that come to mind just as the craziest ones that really took you by surprise with their take on whatever issue might be?
Sure. The rape episode of Too Close for Comfort, where Monroe gets raped by 2 women.
Okay, that's too close for comfort. That's definitely too close for comfort. I don't remember that at all.
Right. So, do you remember the show Too Close for Comfort?
Oh, yeah, big time.
Yeah,
big time.
Cool. So, the Monroe character is interesting. So, I interviewed Jim J. Bullock as well for it, and he told me that the Monroe character initially was going to be... The show was going to actually be kind of a fantasy show, where the Monroe character was going to be like a time traveller. So every time he stepped into the Ted Knight house, he'd be, you know, in medieval gear, or he'd be a hippie, or he'd be, you know, from, I don't know, the Middle Ages, or whatever it was. Yeah. So it was like he'd always change, but they dropped that. And he became...
That's so funny, too, because that's like when the overcomplicated ideas you think you need, and then you're just like, oh, he's just a funny guy.
Yeah.
We don't need that whole gimmick. But when you're coming up with a show, you have like a crazy gimmick.
Yeah, exactly. So they just left him be sort of this sort of sexless, weird clown. Anyway, so because he was such a sexless character, they sort of thought it would be a good idea to give him this sort of traumatic sequence where he basically gets abducted by two large women and raped. And the interesting thing is the episode was written by writers who pretty much didn't want to be there anymore. They were kind of over it. They wanted to move on to other shows. And Jim J. Bullock fervently hated the episode. Like, he goes on in the interview saying he just hated it, thought it was really, uncalled for, obscene. But when you rewatch it, there's one thing that I find fascinating because it actually reminds me of a really interesting made-for-TV movie called The Rape of Richard Beck, and I'll get into that in a second, because in the episode, Ted's character really feels for Monroe, whereas the women kind of don't believe that could happen. So it's kind of this double whammy there, where women basically, these female characters don't believe men could be raped by women. So it's an interesting point there, which it kind of scrutinizes the gender dynamics. But other than that, the episode is fucking crazy and way out and nuts. But then, sort of watching that and sort of looking into that, I thought of this made-for-TV movie with Richard Crenna, who plays a cop who really is an absolute arsehole when it comes to dealing with women getting raped. He just doesn't believe it. And is like, they might have been asking for it, all this sort of horrendous stuff. But then he's gang raped by a bunch of men. And it's full on, and then he becomes this big advocate for, women survivors of sexual assault. So that kind of thing is really interesting to sort of see how the culture's sort of talking about these things. Other episodes that I kind of find, I guess sort of weird and unsettling. There's an episode called Mork Meets Robin Williams, which
I was just listening to the podcast Knowing Robin Williams, and they mentioned this. It sounded very strange.
Oh wow! Oh, you have to see it. It's really moving. So basically, it's about Mindy is a journalist at this point. So she's worked hard to be a journalist. Lovely Pam Dorber. And her and Mork get to interview Robin Williams, and Robin Williams talks about being a celebrity and how it's restrictive, and he can't go anywhere without being recognised, and he feels very lonely, and it's very maudlin and sad. And then by the end of it, when Mork talks to Orson, and it gives me chills just talking about it, Mork talks to Orson and reports back to Orson, and he says, Orson asks, "Isn't it great to be a celebrity?" And he goes, "No, sometimes it's too rough." And you can suffer from it and even die early from it. And he lists people, and he mentions Janis Joplin and whoever, and then he mentions John Lennon, who had just been assassinated at that time.
Oh yes.
And Robin Williams himself is coming through in that performance, and you see him crying, and it's like, fuck, this is so intense now, knowing what happened to him. So it's really, really amazing stuff. It's chilling. As far as like the most confrontational and confronting very special episodes, you can't get past a lot of the All in the Family ones, and also Maude. Just the Norman Lear stuff is just so strong and so dynamic. In All in the Family, the one where Edith is sexually assaulted, the one where Edith loses her faith in God, when her drag queen friend is killed. In Maude, you've got that phenomenal episode called Maude Bears Her Soul, aka Maud and the Psychiatrist, where it's just basically a one-woman show, and B. Arthur just gets to really, really showcase her performance, her dramatic acting style and talents. My Name is Alex from Family Ties scared me as a kid. I remember that because it aired late at night. It wasn't airing at the normal time, and it ran without ads.
Wait, which one was that?
That's the one where Alex's friend dies in a car accident, and he's on his.
Oh yeah.
It's really good. It's set up like a play, like it looks like Our Town. So it's like, vignettes.
Yes.
Yeah, beautiful. That stems from the Maude episode. But yeah, so many good ones. I remember, speaking of earlier ones, I remember the Addams Family meets a beatnik, where there was long stretches in that episode without canned laughter. And I remember as a kid going, fuck, that's not the normal Addamses. And it's all about the generation gap. It was basically the Addams Family and the writers commenting on young people basically reconnecting with their parents. Because this beatnik crashes into the Addams Family house, who are always so loving and supporting and welcoming. But he has this, horrible relationship with his own father, who's this conservative, So it's that period of America changing and young people sort of questioning authority. And the Addams Family is a perfect sort of, connective point there to sort of bridge that gap. So it's, just fascinating stuff to sort of riff on and talk about. And, I've written heaps on these episodes. So I've done 100 and something of the essays so far. And then there's more for me to do. And then all these writers have committed to such beautiful work. I'm getting such excellent work from fellow critics and historians, reading up on their work on, episodes of sitcoms that, some of which I don't really love, like reading about stuff from Full House. It's like, this is fucking awesome.
Oh, yeah.
But you can't pick and choose, you're going to do this, you've got to do everything. If you're going to do this, you have to fucking watch Urkel. So I sort of thought, I'll handball them to some other people.
Let me ask you, maybe this is I don't know if there's an answer to this question, but was there a greater cultural reason for these episodes existing in the first place? Some shows, like you mentioned Punky Brewster, I know that they had to have educational content because of their time slot, but was there like a directive that came down at some point?
Yes.
That is what pushed all this way?
Absolutely. So basically, if you look at the history of American... if you're going to examine VSEs, very special episodes, you have to look at the history of American television. And in the early days, it was basically vehicles for stars, whether they be theatre stars or film stars. So, the Loretta Young show or the what's his name? Danny Thomas show, all those shows are happening, and then you finally get sort of very narrative driven, formulaic sitcoms like I Love Lucy, etc. And then everything becomes sort of halcyon presentations of American domestic bliss. And then you get the wave of fantasy shows, so escapist, comfort blanket shows like Mr. Ed and Bewitched and I Dream of Jeannie and all these great shows. And then Norman Lear comes in and he says, look, this is all great, this is all good, but it's not doing anything, it's not sort of reflecting the times, and it's not overtly commenting on society at the moment and what people are going through. And when the 70s hits, TV sort of, I guess, metaphorically grows up because, America falls into a recession, Vietnam's happening, the counterculture movement's, very in full throttle. Basically, things are shifting and changing. And Norman Lear, as an amazing showrunner and producer, wants to sort of, shake it up and basically put everything that people are seeing on the streets on the television. That was happening in Broadway. Musicals were changing, theatre was changing, and cinema was changing. It was the end of the studio system, so the new Hollywood was stepping in the 70s. So TV was reflective of that. So then he brings in the bunkers, with All in the Family, and people are like, whoa, we're not ready for this. I think the first 6 episodes aired with a disclaimer, a scroll. That's,
I bet.
Yeah.
I feel like these days when that show comes up, sometimes people are like, oh, can you believe there was this racist show called All in the Family? And I'm like, no, he was supposed to be racist.
Yes.
It's not like the show was aware of that.
Exactly. People are stupid. I can't even have those conversations with those people anymore. Basically, All in the Family is so fundamentally beautiful and important and vital to whatever happened after it. You would not have Roseanne, you would not have The Simpsons, you would not have anything outside of, if it wasn't for All in the Family, and also the things that spawned from that. So Maude and Good Times and the Jeffersons, an affluent black family, that is incredible, that's revolutionary. And also just all the characters in the Norman Lear universe are so amazingly rich and complicated and smartly written. And then you have people who kind of came from that generation, that world, like Susan Harris, who's another incredible, remarkable genius, cutting her teeth writing for, shows like The Partridge Family and stuff, but then writes the abortion episode of Maude, which was huge, a major big deal, and I talked to Adrienne Barbeau about that. And then Susan Harris goes and creates Soap, which deconstructs soap operas, and then she creates The Golden Girls, which basically revolutionizes TV as well, and says that elderly women in TV do not have to be just doting grandmothers or just, silly additions to a family or, wise, infantile, advisors of, advice givers. They can be complex, interesting, funny, smart, sexy, flawed, hilarious, smart, stupid people. And that's terrific. And, The Golden Girls is one of the best shows ever, one of the greatest written shows ever. So Susan,
totally.
Yeah,
and so many people.
Absolutely. And Susan Harris was just a genius. Then her husband, who we lost recently, Paul Younger Witt, he's responsible for a whole bunch of other things. Then you have other showrunners like Linda Bloodworth Thomason, who did Designing Women, just an amazing show creator. Howard Leeds, all these shows that came from that sort of 70s and 80s world, Facts of Life, Different Strokes, these are really important. And so when people poo-poo them or don't even acknowledge them or think they're a bit, whatever when they say things like dated, which makes me cringe, because what the fuck does that even mean? I just ignore those people. And I say to them, yeah, you love Will and Grace, that's cool, but go and watch Showtime's sitcom called Brothers, which is remarkable, which was the first show where, a gay character was the star of the show, in a working class situation where he's sort of navigating his life. He's got two straight brothers who are trying to get this, this world, I guess. It's really fascinating stuff. And then if people go and harp on about, there's much more happening, now for, quote unquote minority groups or marginalized groups like blacks or Latinos, it's like, yeah, but you're just ignoring awesome stuff that came before, which was really strong and really complicated and really human. Chico and the Man, my God, like Freddie Prinze is just a genius in that, and that really sort of opens up doors for Mexican visibility. The Jeffersons, which I mentioned, Good Times, someone like Esther Roll, who said to the producers, I've seen a long history of single black mothers on television. I want a husband, I want a father in this show. And then they get the fabulous James, and he's awesome, and they just bounce off each other beautifully. Sadly, of course, JJ becomes kind of like this, pop cultural icon, and James and Esther sort of were like, we're done. So, there's politics in there, and it's a fascinating history there as well. But yeah, I just really revel in that period of television, and it's warm and it's loving, and I just get comforted from watching Facts of Life or Barney Miller or Alice or Good Times or Maude, because they're just fun, and I just think they're really iconic shows. I mean, what Mary Tyler Moore does for the advent of women's liberation is amazing, and yet Mary Tyler Moore, the wonderful, beautiful Mary, was targeted by second-wave feminists and told she wasn't, quote-unquote, feminist enough. And she turned around and said, look, I'm not a placard, I'm not a slogan for movements, I'm a person, and I want to present my character as this person. And the staff of writers, who are predominantly women, not that matters, because everyone can write what they want, but they were like, no, this is Mary, this is our Mary, and this is what she's going to do. She's not going to be this slogan for Gloria Steinem's, campaigns or whatever. And as and Gloria Steinem's great, there's issues with her politics, but we're not going to get into that. But, Mary Tyler Moore's her own entity, and I think that's something that's quite strong as well. So it complicates people's ideas.
You said something a bit ago. This is such a random point to make, but I've always been intrigued by this. I remember back to film school, another TV writer who had worked on Frasier and a bunch of shows. Mm-hmm. He talked about how there was a season of Night Court where the writers didn't want to be on the show anymore, were pissed off about their contracts, and they intentionally tried to tank the show. And you just mentioned something about writers not wanting to be on a show anymore. Is that something that has come up in your research, where writers will try to tank a show or take out their unhappiness within the confines of the show? Yeah.
So a lot of times writers would actually use a lot of personal imprint of their own lives into the show. And then also writers will not be happy with how shows turned out because of dramaturgical advice from the networks. So Richard Vaxey is one of my interviewees, and he's amazing. He was like a big producer and writer on The Golden Girls for many years. And he, I actually complimented him on the suicide episode of Golden Girls called Not Another Monday. Not another Monday, where a friend of Sophia's wants to die. She's just had enough. She's elderly, and she's like, I'm done with life, I'm going to die. And he intended it to be a lot different to what eventuated, but and a lot of it was to do with his own personal experience and just how he wanted to sort of have this episode sort of mapped out. And what happened was the networks have changed a lot of it. I feel like it's a beautiful, profound episode, but he wasn't happy with it. Also, when you think of people like Susan Harris, who actually had what was then what she didn't know what she had back then, but what ended up being chronic fatigue syndrome. She ends up writing the episode. She came back from sort of not writing on The Golden Girls and wrote this 2-part episode called Sick and Tired, where Dorothy has this condition where she doesn't understand what it is, and doctors don't listen to her. And it commented on women not being listened to, elderly people not being listened to, and it was about chronic fatigue syndrome, which really opened doors. That episode really helped. So basically, when writers use their own personal imprint on TV, it's generally sometimes for a positive spin, and just, rather than, wanting to tank the show. I think a lot of writers got lazy. I think there's a lot of great stuff going on that went on in conversation with Good Times, for instance, where Esther Roll used to go into meetings and get really annoyed with a lot of the writers because she didn't feel like the all-Jewish, all-white writing team got black or the black experience. So there was that stuff as well, and they were trying to keep the show afloat. And eventually, she got sort of a bit annoyed, and she would sort of have a major impact as an actress on the scripts. And you see it, and you see how important she was. She was an amazing woman, and they were open to her. But then at times they weren't allowed to sort of, change their stuff because the network was like, no, just stick to what you're doing. Don't listen to her. So there's all this interpersonal politics going on. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff there. But I mean, yeah, the one that springs to mind is that one about Monroe being raped. as far as writers wanting to get off. Yeah. Get off the show.
Okay, here comes one more sitcom question.
Yeah.
And you kind of alluded to it with a Family Ties episode, an Addams Family episode, but what else comes to mind when you think of, for instance, I was watching Growing Pains the other day, and the first episode of the season 3, I think it's called Aloha, it's suddenly they're in Hawaii, and it was like shot with like a single camera, and it was like really like form breaking. I was like, this does not look like Growing Pains. What is this? Like, what are some of the craziest form breaking episodes you can think of? Like you said, there's one that play with Family Ties, but like things along those lines.
Yeah, I'd say definitely Maud, the psychiatrist. Definitely the one with "Hey, my name is Alex." Oh wow, that's a really good point. Good question. Oh, damn. There's, I guess the one... Oh, so, yeah, the Mr. Bell... I guess there's things where they break the mold. So, basically, the PSA ones. So, when Conrad Bain pops up, he's like, hi, America, what you're about to see. Those... Because they used to scare me as a kid. Like, what the fuck am I seeing now? And also, in Mr. Belvedere, there's an episode called The Counselor where Wesley's molested or touched up by his camp counselor. And that doesn't end with Mr. Belvedere writing in his journal. It's just Bryce Beckham and Christopher Hewitt out of character addressing the audience. So that kind of, was a bit chilling. Kate and Ally, the homeless one, which is all on the streets of New York, and shot like a documentary is pretty impressive. There's also the scene in an episode where Rose has PTSD in The Golden Girls, and she's running through a car park and she's being stalked. So it's not in the studio. So all that stuff, yeah, it's a bit sort of like jarring and scary when you see it because you're so used to these characters. Yeah,
especially when you're a kid, it's such a weird thing.
Yeah.
My last sitcom question. What is the legacy of Mr. Belvedere? That show's always been an anomaly in my childhood memory. I never really liked it, but I would watch it all the time.
I love it. I loved it as a kid, but just recently, so maybe 2 years ago, buying them all on DVD. I've just been rewatching them. I mean, they haven't released the last 3 seasons, I think, or 2. But I love it, and it's comfort again. There's a bunch of reasons. I like that Wesley is like the new generation, or the 80s generation Dennis the Menace. I like that Heather and Kevin are these teenagers who are kind of really, really... average, like there's nothing remarkable about them, and I love that, but yet they're really endearing and sweet and complex and flawed. I love the Marsha character, so she's in the book, Eileen Graff, beautiful actress and wonderful musical theatre singer and performer. She was an early Sandy in Grease, actually. But yeah, Marsha, I love her because she's kind of this careerist holding the family together, but also not without her flaws and vulnerabilities. And also I love George because he's kind of the real, blokey and all-American guy, but also would do anything for his family and protects them. And, I love his relationship with Heather, calling her kitten and stuff. I love all that stuff. And Belvedere, just this really judgmental... like pompous but worldly, gorgeous, father figure, and just the tenderness in that show and the sweetness. And all the supporting characters, the beautiful Angela, who's the airhead, but she's got a heart of gold, and Wesley's friend that ends up being Alan, who was Alan in Punky Brewster. But all that stuff, I just love the writing. I love the sweetness of it, the tenderness, the warmth of it. There's something about those sitcoms that are just warm and sweet, and they're just they're so formulaic and so honestly predictable that there's a comfort in them. So it's similar it's similar like to watching slasher movies. You know what's going to happen, so you're like, yes, this is comforting. So when they deflect from that, or they stray from the normal sort of setup or the formula, you're kind of a bit thrown. But when they're just by the numbers, sometimes it's like a warm blanket or eating a nice meal. You know what I mean? Like, it's so comforting.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
This is totally random, but do you know the show Being Eve? I was just watching that again the other night.
I don't know.
From New Zealand. It was like New Zealand, like 2001 through 2003, I think.
No, you don't.
But it's kind of like a Malcolm in the Middle, kind of like much more of a modern show where it's like jumping around from thing to thing.
Right.
But it was a pretty charming show. So back to film for a second here. I feel like we started out as a horror podcast. Most people who listen still are horror fans.
Yeah.
What are, that's a very basic question, but what are a couple of horror movies that most people haven't seen that you would say, go watch this weekend?
Oh God, I could be here for months.
Yeah.
If you give me a subgenre, I'll be able to help you better.
Okay, well, I love animal attacks.
Cool. Choose an animal.
Definitely land. Let's go with a land animal.
Okay.
And I really like the legacy of the film Grizzly.
Okay. Cool.
With things in that realm.
Cool. So, I mean, Grizzly is a masterpiece, but I actually prefer William Girdler's film Day of the Animals. And I really love that film. It's like beautiful, beautiful, tender little Indian trope. One by one, people are knocked off for their hitchhiking. They're hiking. And the altitudes affecting the animals, and the depletion of the ozone layers affecting the animals. It actually inspired Christopher George and Linda Day George to become activists for environmentalism, which is cool. One of the campaign posters actually had the warning signs of CFC's effects on nature, which is amazing. And beautiful animal action in that throughout, from coyotes to mountain lions to blah, blah, blah. But going from your point of Grizzly, so killer bear movies, there's a film called Claws, set in Alaska, which is quite interesting. Waiting for that to have a decent print release. I've only got that on VHS. Prophecy, the Frankenheimer film, which has just...
Oh, yeah. I saw that as a kid.
Oh, it's terrific.
And Talia Shire, is she in that?
Yeah, she's terrific in it. Just a really cool film, really, really good, strong ecological message. And also, the Native American tie-in as well. Really beautiful film. What other killer bear movies are there? But I mean, speaking of sort of, land-dwelling animals en masse killing people, one of my favourites is Robert Klaus's film from 1977, The Pack, which is a bunch of killer dogs on Seal Island with Joe Don Baker. Brilliant film, really, really personal film actually for Robert Klaus, who was very famous for doing work with Bruce Lee, his best friend. He did films with him. But yeah, he also made another film called Deadly Eyes, aka Rats, which is obviously about killer rats, and that's quite interesting because the rats themselves were played by Dachshunds, so little dogs dressed up as rats running around.
I think I've heard of that. That's funny.
Yeah.
Wait, so you said it's a very personal film for him. Was he attacked by a pack of dogs?
No. Just the message in the film, the underlying message. Just basically, he was very much a big animal guy. He loved animals, and he worked alongside with Carl Lewis Miller, who was an amazing animal trainer who worked on films like White Dog and Cujo, etc. And Robert Klaus just had this sort of message movie going on in the guise of this horror film based on a novel that Warner Brothers picked up, and it did well in 1977. Obviously, it was the year of Star Wars, so everything fell behind that, but it did really well. Hope Alexander Willis I interviewed for it. She was the lead lady in that. It's a great cast as well, Bibi Besh and R.G. Armstrong, etc. But Hope Alexander Willis said the film did really well, and it was a personal film for Robert Klaus because he wanted to really put an imprint of humans basically being kind to animals, because the whole thing about the pack is these dogs are neglected and they're left alone, and because of that they form a pack and get all vicious on humans, which makes total sense. And the final shot in that movie is Joe John Baker with one of the dogs who will end up being rehabilitated, I guess, and him just sort of touching the dog's snout and the dog licking him, kissing him. So it's this kind of nice, even though it's a really full-on and at times quite brutal film, it is all about, being nice, being kind to nature because it will bite you. And that last frame, that last image really summarises, man's connection with dog and how you should not fuck with it. But there's so many good animal horror movies of that period.
Let me give you another subgenre. Australian animal attacks movies.
Okay.
I mean, I know like Razorback kind of. I know that.
Do you know? Have you seen Long Weekend?
No.
Oh, you love Long Weekend. Long Weekend is about the most unlikable couple ever, who basically, in order to save their marriage or to try and fix up their marriage, go for a drive out to the coast, to basically the bush. And what happens is, it's a really fascinating film because it's very much akin to something like The Birds, where basically the human ugliness or the human complexity and disdain for one another and sort of all that sort of stuff reflects on nature, and nature sort of inexplicably attacks. So basically, as they kind of bicker and constantly go at each other, like George and Martha and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, the animals start to react and they become quite aggressive. So you have eagles and even possums, all these creatures basically turning on this couple. And what happens is it becomes this kind of power play between the couple and them sort of against this natural background, which becomes uglier and uglier and more unwelcoming as the film progresses. It's amazing.
Yeah, that sounds amazing.
And it's also, they're so disrespectful to nature. So it's also got a really nice, not only environmental message, but a really strong, solid message about the indigenous cultures here who've basically been, completely fucked by white colonialism. And that film really comments on that without even being overt. It's amazing. Another film is Dark Age, which is actually very much overtly about indigenous culture. So Dark Age is a killer crocodile movie. Where basically the indigenous population of this town understand this crocodile and the crocodile's position, but white people don't. So it's this kind of jarring, racial tension happening there. And it was written by a wonderful writer who's passed away since. She only died young. Her name was Sonia Borg. And she was amazing. She actually wrote the film kind of in a response to what was happening at the time, because it was released in 1988, which was the Australian bicentenary. So when Australia was celebrating their bicentenary, she writes this film, which is all about how white people and Eurocentric people have fucked up the indigenous nations. So it's really interesting, really clever film, biting social commentary. Another animal horror film from Australia, which I really like, is a later film, a lot later, called Rogue. Which I like, because I don't really like a lot of modern stuff.
I've noticed that.
But this one I really liked because it was just in and out and strong, and it was once again the 10 Little Indians motif, and it was kind of monster in the house kind of deal, like a parlor room thing. Who's next? And I liked that, and it was really strong and sharp, and I liked there was a concept of who should be the sacrificial person, and weighing out who's the most vulnerable or who is the sickest or who's the least important here. It was good. I liked it. But yeah, there are quite a few good Aussie horror films. I don't understand why there aren't more ecological horror films, because we've got all this scope, this land. But I love, the eco horror thing is amazing. There's some really severely neglected ones, which I think, I just recently bought of Unknown Origin, which I just love. That is just an amazing film where, the guy just
That's rats, right? Is that rats?
Yeah, it's one mother rat. And just...
Oh, it's the big one, right?
Yeah.
I can't remember where I know this movie from.
Yeah. And it's terrific. And also there's that great segment in Nightmares. Remember that anthology movie?
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, I remember Nightmares very well. I used to always rent that for some reason.
Yeah. And Veronica Cartwright and The Rat. Yeah, it's cool. But yeah, there's so many good films. But I want to just stress, you talked about horror movies that people haven't seen. I think people need to branch out and not just watch what they think is a typical horror film. So a lot of filmmakers get neglected in the realm of horror, and one of them is the legendary Robert Altman. So Robert Altman has made 3 ridiculously impressive, really, really unsettling horror movies. And they're all incredibly female centric, and they're all about, psychosis and repression. And one of them is That Cold Day in the Park, with Sandy Dennis, who plays this woman who is sexually repressed and surrounded by elderly people, very similar to, I guess, Mia Farrow in Rosemary's Baby. And she's repressed by this situation she's in. And one day she sees a boy in the park, a young teenage boy in the park in the rain, and she goes and welcomes him inside, and she becomes obsessed, and she basically keeps him a prisoner. And it's a fascinating character study and really, really unnerving and scary. Like, we screened it with Cinemaniacs a couple of years ago, and the audience was like on the edge of their seat. And it's a really, pond-like, quiet parlor room horror film. The other one is 3 Women with Sissy Spacek and Shelley Duvall, which is one of my favourite identity crisis horror movies. And the other one is Images, which I really love. I love that film as well. I think that's really terrifying. Psychosis, female neurosis horror, but just so many good things. I think there's a lot of neglected films that people just don't assume are horror films, but they are. And I used to write a column called Secretly Scary, where basically I argue a lot of films that aren't considered horror films or were marketed as horror films actually are. And so if you think,
I love that.
Yeah, so if you think of films like The Swimmer or David and Lisa or They Shoot Horses, Don't They? Or, all these movies are quite horrific and grisly and dark, and read like horror movies. And I think that's what people sort of just start to sort of look into. So when I see those kind of endless, documentary series or lists where they just go on about the same fucking film, it just drives my head in. So it's like, yeah, we all love Freddy, we all love Jason, but there's more. And it's a long history. It's a long history, not just American either, but it's a long history of cinema. I want to sort of champion film when people go, Halloween's the first slasher. It's not. If you go back, even before things like Black Christmas, and even before things like Blood and Black Lace, you have films like 13 Women, which is a pre-code horror film with Myrna Loy, where she basically plays this half-caste woman who's teased and picked on by her sorority, so she kills them off one by one. So it's like the first body count film. There's all these great films from the 30s that people need to sort of go back and look at, because they're just incredible formative films. And then, so people sort of just don't really see that in regards to watching horror films, because they tend to stick to 70s and 80s. Not everyone, but a lot of that kind of consciousness does that. And now I'm seeing like a 90s nostalgia kick, and I'm like, oh fuck, I stopped watching films then. But I will say one thing though about the 90s. The 90s did usher in superb documentaries about cinema. So there was a lot of stuff coming in then, like there was great documentaries being made about classic cinema. So you had films like The Bronze Screen, I think that was a bit later, but there was The Celluloid Closet and Visions of Light, and all those documentaries about classic cinema were friggin' awesome. But yeah, it's funny, yeah. So when you ask me underseen, underappreciated horror films, there's so many. Like if you're going to talk, say, vampire cinema, maybe embrace something like Let's Scare Jessica to Death, which is like a cool revisionist vampire film.
Oh yeah, that's definitely. I never thought about that really as a vampire movie, but I guess it is.
Yeah. Possession themed films. There's films like Full Circle and all these amazing films. But yeah, there's so many things. Like if you go through each subgenre, I think like when we did the Hagsploitation film festival for Cinemaniacs, that was really eye opening, because we opened up people to all these films they probably hadn't ever heard of. Films like Revenge, which is a TV movie with Shelley Winters, where she keeps a man captive because she thinks he had raped her daughter, but he hasn't. Films like Whatever Happened to Auntie Roo, What's the Matter with Helen, Straight Jacket, all these great, films which starred all these incredible actresses from the golden age now doing these incredible movies. A film like Games with Simone Signoret and all these films. So all these films are just sort of, captivating and really engaging to watch, and always underappreciated because everyone just constantly goes back to the same thing. And it's funny, I don't know what it's like where you are, but in Melbourne there's this constant blind love and appreciation for certain subgenres and certain filmmakers, And that's cool. Like, yeah, we all know that, David Lynch is amazing. Yes, he is. But it's like, okay, there's other things. And he'll be the first person to fucking tell you there's other people. So it's kind of that thing where people kind of go into trends and they don't know how to branch out. And I think if you're going to be if you're going to love cinema, you should love all of it and keep watching a whole bunch of things. So whenever I talk to horror fans, I try and introduce them to musicals or westerns or gangster films. When I talk to like musicals fans, I go, okay, watch this slasher film, watch this, drama from the 20s, that kind of thing. So it's basically mixing it up and making sure everyone watches everything because it's really all important. So I think that's something, and also really really sort of embracing the genre stuff, because then the other spectrum of that are people who are snobs and won't watch horror films or musicals or westerns because they don't do quote unquote escapist genres. It's like, well, you're an idiot. You're missing out on the foundations of great cinema and the genres that built studios. So that kind of pisses me off as well. So I just get angry all the time. But I just think people need to embrace more and have a wider shooting range and just get into stuff, because I think they're missing out if they don't, and if they're just watching the crap that's churned out at the multiplexes and watching the endless fucking Marvel movies, they're missing out. There's a really cool quote, I'm going to paraphrase him, but I love what he says at the end of the documentary. It was a documentary about William Friedkin called Friedkin Uncut. And William Friedkin... Oh, yeah, I saw that. Oh, it's great. And you probably remember where he goes, you can't compare things like Singing in the Rain to La Dolce Vita or King Kong to, Once Upon a Time in the West. These are all masterpieces. You can't compare them. But you'd be a fucking idiot if you compared Singing in the Rain to, Superman versus Batman. And he's right. You can't... These films that are churned out, I'm all Team Scorsese. I really am. I think they're dumbing people down, because back in the day, superhero movies were beautiful and they were special. Like, The first Superman was just beautiful. Superman 2 as well. Even 3 has its charms with Annette O'Toole as Lana Lang in the Smallville sequences. The first Batman film and Batman Returns, which I think is one of the most beautiful, perfect, just poetic, and it's a monster movie, and it's so angry and romantic and dark and demented. But then now you just have every fucking thing coming out all the time. The 12th Thor film, and they all look the same. They all look like they've been shot on some Mac. And there's no heart. So I just, I'm just like, just stop going to these and go and see something else, or go and don't buy the 9th rendition of Star Wars on Blu-ray. Spend that money on 3 Warner Archives films, or get a couple of Kino Lorber movies, or watch something from the 40s or 50s. Just branch out. Or if you love Star Wars, go and see what it comes from. It's not an original invention. It comes from Westerns, and it comes from opera, and it comes from Japanese cinema, and it comes from the Bible, and it comes from all these other things. So go and research that and watch all that stuff, and you'll be surprised. So I think that's something as well. So when I do Cinemaniacs, I like having a platform to talk about movies, because at the part, just drinking, people can just turn off. They go, okay, Lee, shut the fuck up. But at a talk, when I'm on a podium, I get to just talk and have that control, which is fun. And I like to make sure that people get that, and when I'm talking about, say, one film, I'm going to riff on as many as I want to, because they've all got nice interpersonal or thematic connections. So I think that's something that people need to do as well. They go, oh, fuck, yeah, you're right. John Carpenter, he's amazing. He's such an amazing filmmaker. I love him. But yeah, he really does love these Westerns. And oh my God, he loves Vincent Minnelli. Oh, fuck, let me check out those films. So that's where people grow and they go, yeah, you're right. The Bandwagon is a masterpiece. I didn't think of it. Well, yes, it is. So that kind of thing where people sort of go off and they'll, explore revisionist Westerns for a month, and they come back and they're like, wow, have you seen Man in the Wilderness or The Man Who Loved Cat Dancing? Like, of course I have, They're stunning. Like, that's what you should be celebrating. So I think that's something that people need to do. Just talk, engage, build film community, get out of comfort zones. They're dangerous. And just watch as much as you can. If you're a film person, I mean, if you don't give a shit, then you don't give a shit. But if you care, or if you say you love film, then you should probably watch a lot more. And I say that to a lot of writers as well, screenwriters or filmmakers or independent theatre makers and stuff, you got to see beyond what you're creating. You can't just think that what you're creating is the ends all, because it's not coming from anywhere new. There's no new stories, but embrace stuff that came before you, because it's important, and it's influential and informative, and can inform you without losing sight of your own beautiful work. So that kind of thing, I think.
I was gonna say I love that, and you mentioned Cinemaniacs. If we could just talk about that for a moment, because I can't believe what a cool theater and situation you have there. Like, what are some of the things you have coming up there?
Oh, cool. Well, I'd like to hear your thoughts on, because you've come to, what did you come to?
I saw Mad Men.
Awesome. There. Yeah, so you would have seen...
And
yeah.
I had no idea it even existed. I came across the screening. I was like, what is this? And I was like, Cinemaniacs. And then I go there, and it's like a really cool theater. It's a really cool venue. And it seems like you're playing stuff that's not the obvious repertory stuff. It's like actually interesting, and you pair it with lectures, and it's just really cool.
Oh, thank you. Well, there you go. You've just summarized it. So, what's your question? Sorry, what?
I was just saying, what do you have coming up?
Yeah, cool. So we've just announced our 2020 season, which is really cheery. So the first season is all about films that sparked protest, and the second season is suicide in film. So the first season, we're talking about films that generated protests from activists. So we've actually screened a lot of those that fit that bill prior to this coming year. Mm-hmm. We've screened.
So would that be like Cruising? Comes to mind?
Correct. So we've screened Cruising before, and we've screened Maniac, and we've screened Dress to Kill. So we've screened and Silent Night, Deadly Night. So we've screened a lot that have. But this year we've designed it. So Sally Christie's co-programming. So she runs Cinemaniacs with me with a team. Hande Noyan, Therese Matashenki, Darren Kotzer-Buyukas, Bria Baker, Kobe J. And we just at Anthony Biancafiore, and we run this team basically to make sure Melbourne sees a whole bunch of different films. So Sally programmed Basic Instinct, which actually had uproar from gay activists.
Oh yeah. Yep. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. Desperate Living, the John Waters film, which had protests from lesbian groups, which was very bizarre. Jesus Christ Superstar, the Norman Jewison film, which had a lot of outrage from Christian groups, especially through its theatrical run, like the stage show, the musical. And the film also sparked a riot in Rome. There was also, what else did she program? Cannibal Holocaust, which is, without going on to... Yeah, it speaks for itself. And then we have the Suicide season, which I programmed, which is, pretty grim, but they're all diverse films. So they're all films about varied aspects of suicide. So you have The Children's Hour, Network, Ordinary People, They Shoot Horses, Don't They? And Night Mother, which not many people know, which is based on a play. It's a two-hander with Sissy Spacek and Anne Bancroft.
Oh, yeah. I know this movie from... I remember it coming up. I think I feel like Nina mentioned it in film school, or someone brought it up. It's a daughter tells the mother that she's going to kill herself that night or something, right? And it's all the conversation between them. Is that what that is?
That's it.
Yeah, but I've never seen it, obviously.
Yeah, you need to. It's amazing. When are you back?
Back in Australia?
Yeah.
I'll be back this July. Same dates. I'm going to go there for the winter again.
Oh, yeah,
for your
cool.
winter, my summer.
Yeah, cool. So I think I'm not sure what we got on that time. Maybe that's the start of the second season. So I think we open with... Oh, God, I can't remember. Maybe the Children's Hour? But yeah, you'll come and you'll see. And the Children's Hour will be beautiful. I'm doing a big lecture for that. But I'm not sure if it is the Children's Hour. But have you seen that film?
No, I have no idea. I don't even know what it is.
Amazing. So... I don't know if I can tell you much about it without giving it away, but it's based on Lillian Hellman's work, and it was actually made earlier called These Three. It was made into a film called These Three in the 30s, and then it was remade in early 1960s, 61, I believe, called The Children's Hour, and it tells the real story. So basically it's two teachers, played by Shirley MacLaine and Audrey Hepburn, who run an all-girls school in New England, and a little girl who absolutely despises them makes up a lie, and what happens from that lie and what the repercussions are. And it's really tragic, and incredibly dark, and it's a big landmark film. So I think you'll really enjoy it. It's a really heavy film, and little Veronica Cartwright's in it as well.
Oh wow!
Yeah, she's great. She has a fantastic scream in it, and it's kind of like an evil child movie actually, because the Karen Balkan character of Mary is like Rhoda in a way. So it's kind of got that aspect going for it as well. It's really cool.
Here, I'm going to ask you one last question, because I just thought of it. There might not be an answer to it, but maybe there is. But is there a horror subgenre that you really like that you don't even know that people even know exists? Do you know what I mean? Like a subgenre, like, for instance, non-Catholic possession is a subgenre. I don't even know if that exists.
Wow, that's so weird you said that, because when I did the programming for Hauntings and Possessions, I distinctly chose ones that had no Judaic or Christian background. So I screened The Possession of Joel Delaney, which deals with the Puerto Rican voodoo. I can't remember what it's called. I feel bad not remembering, but that's a fantastic film with Shirley MacLaine again, and what's his name? Perry King, stunning film. Christine, The Entity. What else did I screen that time? Oh fuck, I can't remember. But yeah, I remember distinctly doing it, so it was not Christian or Jewish based. So that was interesting. So yeah, I think that definitely is the case. We're doing a journal at the moment, but it's not so much just horror, but it definitely has that aspect. At the moment, we're doing a journal on trapped man syndrome in film. So there is like this interesting subsector of films where crazed women or females, going back to your monkey shines, trap a man. So if you think of That Cold Day in the Park, which I mentioned earlier, monkey shines, because Ella is a girl monkey and she keeps him sort of at bay, even though he's obviously in a wheelchair, but she keeps him there. Misery, The Beguiled, all these films where these women keep these guys sort of kept and trapped. Sunset Boulevard, is the queen of.
Oh wow, yeah.
Yeah.
I would never have thought of that as a genre, but it completely is.
Yeah. So I think there's that. But yeah,
well, we got an answer. That's so great.
Cool.
Lee, amazing talking to you. You're like an encyclopedia, and I feel like you already said this, but I just love the way that you appreciate everything from sitcoms to these animal attacks movies, and like finding value in all of this stuff that people don't even look at a lot of times.
Oh, thank you. I guess that's what I'm here for.
Yeah, but everyone should check out your books, and I have them all, and I'll be getting that sitcom book when it comes out.
Thank you so much, Ed. Such a pleasure to talk to you.